Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Sarah? Okay.
Yeah.
So, and thank you everyone for coming here in person and online. I think there are some quite a number of people online and also here, so that's excellent. I have the greatest joy to introduce you, Andrew. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be introducing him, but Sajjad, who had the brilliant idea of inviting Andrew while he was visiting the UK, but Sajjad couldn't come. So it's my honor, and I won't waste much of your time because I would rather like Andrew to introduce himself and his research in the usual format. So he will talk about first his own journey, and then reach his current research, and then the book. Thank you. And then we will go to the question and answer.
Great. Thank you, Ishtan. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone who's here, who's attending in person and online. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's my first time in Exeter, believe it or not. I've spent a fair amount of time in Devonshire, in Dartmoor and Exmoor and so forth. My first time in the city. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I understand that you guys have a interesting tradition at the Majlis of having the speaker speak about him or herself for a little bit. It's not something I normally do or like to do. I don't like to presume that there's anything that interesting about my personal journey. I'm not sure where it begins and where it ends. So maybe I should work backwards a little bit. Today, I am speaking about a book that I wrote together with the Tunisian political thinker, politician, political prisoner, and as of today, hunger striker, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who, as I'm sure many of you know, was the head of the Tunisian Ennahda party until the coup of 2021, spent many, many years in exile in London from the early 1990s until the Jasmine Revolution of 2011. And we spent a number of days in the winter of 2016 and 17, and then at various points later, 2018 and 19, working on this volume, which I'll turn to in more detail in a bit, called On Muslim Democracy, which is it's a collection of some of his essays and a long introduction by me, and then half the book is a kind of philosophical, theological dialogue between him and me on various issues related to Islamic law, democracy, pluralism, the modern state, his own intellectual journey, so on and so forth. How did I get there? Well, to jump back a little bit before then, after the Jasmine Revolution of 2011, I was planning on attending a conference in Tunisia, and I had been aware of Ghannouchi's work for quite a while. In my first book, which I wrote as a PhD student at Oxford, which became Islam and Liberal Citizenship, I drew on some of his writings and fatwa and those sorts of things, but he was not a central figure in my own research. But I had this idea that after the Arab revolutions of 2011, that I was interested in what kinds of conceptions of lawmaking, sovereignty, popular participation, or reintroduction of Islamic law might take place if parties like the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood or Tunisia's Ennahda were to become, over a long period of time, part of the government. So I was interested then in his ideas as a legal thinker, as a legal theorist, his understanding of Sharia. And I thought that for this conference, I might write a paper on his ideas as an Islamic legal theorist. I picked up his 1993 book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which at that time was only in Arabic. Since then, I supervised and edited the translation of that book into English, which came out, I think, in 2022. And I went into the book thinking I'm going to look into his views on maslaha or maqasid al-sharia, how to formulate Islamic law. And I quickly discovered that the book was centrally about something else. It was centrally about the place of the people or the ummah overall in a legitimate public order in an Islamic state. And I was particularly struck by the repeated use of a particular concept, namely the concept that in Islamic political theology and political philosophy, the fundamental status of the people at large, both in the singular and in the collective, is as God's caliph or khalifa on earth. So I was immediately struck by this idea, and I was struck by how pervasive it was throughout the entire book. And immediately, my research shifted. I was in that period in between my first and second book. I had a number of ideas for a second book that came out of my first book, and I was immediately struck by the centrality of this claim that in Islam, the people is sovereign because the people is God's deputized khalifa, vicegerent, lieutenant, deputy on earth. And that then turned into a genealogy of this idea, going back to 19th century reformers, the Syrian thinker, Rashid Rida, Abu Ala Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, many others throughout the 20th century, how they came to think about popular sovereignty and how the concept of the ummah or mankind at large as God's khalifa on earth became central to this. And that became my second book, The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought. And in a way that was sparked just by this kind of, what was supposed to be a casual encounter with Ghanouchi's book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. And a close reading and analysis of his thought became the sort of culminating chapter of that book. So as time went on, and I became more and more interested in his thought, I was editing a translation series with Yale University Press, and I wanted to translate this book. And so I gradually started to reach out to him and his family and made contact. He was visiting Yale at the time as part of another talk, and that was when I first met him. And I started to visit Tunisia quite frequently, visited him sort of casually in his home and began to talk about this. And then the idea crystallized more seriously about having a book that combined sort of a publication of his works along with a kind of sustained dialogue between the two of us. The book is quite unique. I will get to it in more detail shortly. But this idea of a book as a dialogue between political philosophers has a certain kind of legacy. There are, there's a well-known volume on and about the writings of the Iranian political philosopher Abdul Karim Soroush, in which there's a lengthy dialogue. After 9/11, there was a lengthy philosophical dialogue between a journalist and Derrida and Habermas. So it's a kind of a genre of developing political philosophy, and I was drawn to that. So how did I get then to the point, since this is supposed to be a bit more of a personal journey, how did I get to the idea around 2011 that I would be researching this? Did my DPhil at Oxford between 2000 and 2006. I entered, having studied Arabic for a number of years previously to that. I first visited Palestine in 1996, the spring of 1996, before I entered university, and spent some time in a refugee camp south of Bethlehem. And I had been to Tunisia before that, but this was my first kind of sustained immersion into an Arabic-speaking environment, and sort of arrived at university very motivated and driven to study Arabic formally. So I ended up doing that as an undergrad. One of my majors, as they call it in the States, at some point, many semesters doubling up on Arabic, the standard kind of Arabic grammar and language, along with Arabic literature and other sorts of things. So I was quite driven and passionate about it. When I got to Oxford, it was to study political theory, not Arab and Islamic studies or what I imagine they still call the Oriental Institute, but as a political philosopher. And so I was interested in lots of things. I actually first, I don't know if it falls under this center, but I wrote my master's thesis on Uzbekistan and post-Soviet legitimation of authoritarian rule in Uzbekistan. That's where I actually was on 9/11, came back to Oxford. And the intellectual part of the journey is, you know, I don't know, I think the Exeter political philosophers, I think, you know, many of them come from Oxford. And there's a certain kind of mindset that there's a big difference between doing political philosophy and doing area studies or anthropology or merely studying what people think. And so there was a intellectual project about how to think about different ethical, political, and philosophical traditions in a comparative way. And so, so there was a kind of meta methodological and ethical project of how to bring the study of Islamic law and the study of Islamic political thought into fairly mainstream, in some ways very conservative Oxonian political philosophy. And so that was a large part of my motivation for my first book, which ended up being a study of, well, if you're speaking to political philosophers, it was a study of the points of conflict and consensus between liberalism and Islam about a shared conception of citizenship. If you're talking to Islamic studies people, it's about the somewhat technical discourse of what's known as fiqh al-aqaliyat, or the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities, which was quite large at one point. There's some, you know, many impressive tomes on how Muslims should regard the obligations of Islamic law while living in a non-Muslim state, and whether the form of governance of that state makes a difference. So that was my first book, and a number of other articles came out of that. And so I don't know. I hope that's enough of an introduction to my personal journey. It's not, in my opinion, what's sort of most gripping about what I want to talk about today. But I think that tells you a little bit about how I came to put this book together with Sheikh Rashid. It was in some ways a kind of realization of, I think, some of the ideas that I had 23 years ago, when I was first trying to come up with my PhD dissertation, which was this idea that somebody could be an active, engaged thinker in multiple traditions, that you're not just studying another tradition as an outsider or studying it as an object of thought, but you could be entering into it in a kind of engaged way while also representing another tradition that you may come from. And so having this encounter with Ghannouchi, about whom I had already sort of written much of a book, and whose thought I knew very well, and whose thought I had many opinions about, and a lot of curiosity about, and how to push it in various directions. And so it was a great privilege at the intellectual and personal level to have somebody that was interested also in this kind of encounter. And I suppose the final context, political context in which this book is framed, and this is really the segue into the volume itself, was a certain shift in either political ideology or political branding from a traditional ideology of political Islam or Islamism to what Ennahda themselves referred to in their 2016 Party Congress as an ideology of Muslim democracy. So 5 years after the revolution, 2 years after the adoption of a new constitution that Ennahda took part in writing and developing and negotiating, there was this well-known declaration that we no longer regard ourselves as belonging to political Islam. We no longer regard that as relevant. We adopt something called Muslim democracy. And in my previous book, again, that was largely motivated by and ultimately about Ghannouchi's thought, I was focused on a different concept of Islamic democracy, this idea that a political system could be an alternative to Western parliamentary democracy, but it could be fundamentally democratic on the assumption that you were dealing with a particular conception of the people, a conception of the demos that would be democratic. And that conception rested to a large extent on the assumption of a kind of moral unity, that we assume that if a people is Muslim, at least in its vast majority, and is committed emotionally, epistemically, morally to realizing the status of God's vicegerent on earth, then Islam calls for a certain kind of democratic governance of that people. And so that attempt to invent a concept of popular sovereignty for the Islamic tradition was what my second book, The Caliphate of Man, was about. 5 years into the Tunisian revolution, you have the Islamist party saying, well, no, we're not Islamists anymore. We're Muslim Democrats. And so I was also very interested in what does that mean? And is it, like many scholars say, nothing? It is a form of party branding. It is a signal to both domestic and foreign rivals that you don't need to be scared of us, and please don't repress us. We're not trying to monopolize power. We're just like the parties that you're familiar with in Europe that refer to themselves as Christian Democrats. So you should see us in those lights rather than in the lights of the way you've traditionally understood Islamist parties. So I was very interested in how Ghannouchi himself understood that transition from a previous conception of the state to a contemporary one, whether he saw it as continuity or a kind of break, and whether the differences that I found central to that as a political philosopher, the depth of the understanding of pluralism, what the Islamic Sharia means, those sorts of things, whether he was willing to sort of comment on that in greater depth than he had in his public writings to that point. So I think that's kind of the context. Should I pause now to solicit any follow-ups on the personal journey aspect of the talk, or?
So this, for those who are not familiar with the Majlis, the purpose of the Majlis is normally that after conference discussion at a dinner table, and that's what we're doing.
Pre-prandial, getting to know one another.
So you could say some words, how did you get interested about your background?
Okay.
Background family, and how did you get interested into Arabic studies at all?
Right. Well, it was a circuitous route. Since you're inviting me to be personal, I come from a very small town in a rural part of America, a state called Maine. I went to a very small school that had about 60 pupils in its graduating class. And I was very restless and I was very discontented. And so Istvan and I have been going back. So make a long story short, at 16, I actually went to Eastern Europe and lived in Slovakia for a couple of years in a city that was formerly the capital of Hungary. And so it's impossible to live there without picking up some words of Hungarian. And so I spent actually the first years of sort of this late childhood, early adulthood, much more interested in Slavic studies in Eastern Europe. I spent a year there, and then I went back as a gap year in between high school and university, spent another year traveling around, started learning Polish, started learning Russian, and then just before that visit to Palestine I mentioned, I did a solo journey through the former Yugoslavia. This was 1996, so it was right after the war in Bosnia. Didn't know a lot. Slavic languages, those of you that are studying Arabic, it's a decent comparison to say that they're a little bit like different Arabic Ammiyats. If you've spent your whole life only studying Syrian Arabic and you get dropped in Algeria, within a week or two, you can probably get along. And so I was picking up Serbian quite well. And then I ended up in Kosovo before the war, which at that point was sort of occupied by Serbia. They had annulled the autonomy that Kosovo had under Yugoslavia. And kind of by a series of sort of accidents, I ended up with these Albanian students that were studying in houses. They'd sort of taken their entire political and educational system and gone underground. So the universities were now in houses. There was a legal system that was sort of operating on an informal basis, and there's a kind of form of resistance. They had declared independence, but they didn't at that point want to turn to arms, and so it was a kind of sort of underground resistance to Serbian rule by way of opting out of governance and governing themselves and their society separately. And then I was arrested by the Serbs. We were brought to state security and interrogated, kicked out, dropped at the Albanian border, made my way through Albania, Macedonia, back into Kosovo, and then was very, very motivated by this and kind of resolved to come back. So I started university and I started studying Arabic very intensely, but I also kept up with Russian. I started studying Serbian formally as well as Albanian. I don't know whether the Arab and Islamic studies extends to the Balkans. I know you have a lot of Ottoman stuff here, but so I went back to Kosovo during the summer of 1997. By that point, I picked up pretty good Albanian, and that was before the war, and spent a lot of time researching, at that time, sort of parallel institutions as a mode of resistance. And then that led to another set of interests in different ways in which ethno-separatist conflict had been resolved or not resolved, or partitioning of institutions. And so I did a senior thesis on Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Palestine. So I went back to Palestine in 1999, and at that point spoke Arabic better and was able to use Arabic for my research. And it's very, very hard to remember now, but that was a time in which people thought that maybe the Oslo system was going to lead to a two-state solution, or that it was about the development of certain Palestinian governing institutions, and that was obviously not what ended up happening. So again, I'm not sure how much of this is actually of interest to anybody, but I spent a lot of time before my PhD thesis spread in a lot of different directions. I obviously enjoyed studying languages. There was a kind of overlap of the Islamic world and the Ottoman world between, Central Asia, the Balkans, Palestine. So I was sort of, interested in exploring lots of different things, but also figuring out what my primary intellectual field was. It took me a while to kind of settle in political theory and political philosophy. That didn't happen, I think, towards the end of my undergraduate period. There's a personal reason as well, in that I had a son when I was at undergraduate, who's now 25. So as I was becoming eventually a single father, I sort of had to say, well, what can I actually do? I can sit in a library at the Bodleian all day, much more and be a father, much more easily than I could be running off to Kosovo or Palestine or Uzbekistan every 3 months. So there was also a kind of personal way in which what my life allowed me to do just practically lended itself more to the kinds of things that could be done in libraries and through books rather than constantly being on the ground someplace. So, sometimes the biography between how people end up trying to produce knowledge is not irrelevant. Kifaya?
At this point, you can have it, or you can save it for the question. But let's save it for the question and that answer. I just want to say that we had a Majlis, which is online already on the Bosnian hardship.
Yes.
2 weeks ago, so you can watch it if you are.
I don't know if anybody in here, is somebody in here a PhD student or thinking of your PhD thesis? No? Okay. Well, I will say that, well, I don't want to talk about them. But what I do want to say is, before I was choosing a DPhil, I was sort of motivated by, well, what do I want to do right now? Wouldn't it be fun to go to Uzbekistan? Wouldn't it be fun to go here? And when you choose a PhD thesis, like many things, it concentrates the mind, and you start to think, what do I want to be doing for 20 or 30 years as opposed for 1 or 2 years? And I did not want to spend 20 or 30 years studying Central Asia, Uzbekistan, or even, by that point, the Southern Balkans. And so I had been studying Islamic thought and Arabic all along, but at some point, when you commit yourself to a DPhil, you're also thinking about what do you think is something that you want to make a life out of? What do you want to, and what do you want to do for 20 or 30 years or more? But also, what do you think you are going to find an endless well of interest and fascination and things that you can commit yourselves to? And so that's a little bit of the story about why out of all of these things, at some point, I turned, in a more concentrated fashion to Islamic law and Islamic political thought, mostly from Arabic sources, as opposed to some of the other stuff I was thinking about. So, good. Well, a little embarrassing. I'm not used to, I don't really, yeah. Okay. Let me share my screen here. And let's see, where is the slideshow? Sorry, new slide, renew slide. Oh, yeah, right there. From beginning. How's that? Okay. Well, so there's two separate titles. Is this?
You're going to put down this.
Sure. Yeah, is that better? No, that didn't close that. Yeah. Maybe that's projecting from there, I think. No, I think that, yeah, that one's from that computer. There we go. All right. So, technically, it's a book talk about this book on Muslim democracy, essays and dialogues. Sheikh Rashid is the primary author. I'll get to the, well, you see what this is. So it begins with an introduction by me, in which I sort of address this question right here. From Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy. And then, I don't know if any of the political theorists colleagues showed up today, but I try to give an argument that what's going on in this turn to Muslim democracy is a turn to a post-sovereigntist conception of Islamic political thought. And those of you that have studied or encountered any aspects of 20th century Islamic political thought, particularly figures like Maududi or Sayyid Qutb, are familiar, of course, with the claim that the fundamental commitment of Islam is that God is sovereign, and that the fundamental principle of any Islamic political order is God's sovereignty, or hakimiyatullah. And so that second book that I was telling you about talks about the developments in which the ummah, or the people, is also accorded a kind of sovereignty. And that the conception of Islamic democracy is a way of working out how both God and the people can be sovereign. And I'm going to have to say a few things about my arguments in that book. And what I end up arguing is that sovereignty is a concept that structures thought in a particular way. It inclines towards a certain kind of imaginary, and it imagines politics around a certain set of concepts that are not necessary for the study of politics or for thinking about politics, and in some ways are done away with by this turn to Muslim democracy. So then there's 10 essays by Ghannouchi translated for this book, all but one of them for the first time. And one of them's a retranslation, but I sort of re-edited that translation considerably. And then you see here, these are, again, about half the book, the dialogues between him and me, divided up between a discussion of his biography and formation, Majlis style, themes of democracy, sovereignty, and morality, the universal caliphate, democracy in the meaning of the Sharia, and freedom, pluralism, and toleration. This is us. Him, well, I have more gray hair now. This is probably about the same. So, anyway, I want to pause here. This is a talk about the book. I encourage you, if you're interested in these ideas, whether because you're interested in democracy and religion, or because you're interested in the trajectory and fate of political Islam, I think it's a major step. As I'm sure a lot of you know, Ennahda and the Tunisians were not the first to embrace this idea of Muslim democracy. It actually, on the part of some scholars, goes back to the 90s. The Turkish AKP in the early 2000s referred to themselves as Muslim Democrats. It's been used in Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia. And so when Ennahda was doing this, it was both, again, signaling, oh, think of us like the Christian Democrats, but for Muslims, but it was also referring to a certain kind of history in which some parties signaled their acceptance of political orders as they existed by adopting this label, somehow signaling their moderation or their lack of interest in revolutionary transition. So there's a history to it, but the but what it actually means or implies as a political ideology was not really formulated in a lot of the secondary literature. In fact, a lot of the secondary literature on this by people like Asif Bayat and Vali Nasser downplay the importance of ideology or thought in these movements. Looking at groups, again, like in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, they will say these are not really ideological parties. They don't come out of an ideological tradition. They're competing for vote share, and they are attempting to signal to a certain kind of socially conservative base where they stand, but it's mostly a kind of electioneering. Another important distinction is that in all of these countries, these are parties that emerged within existing non-democratic regimes. And so there is a phenomenon in which they are operating within the constraints of political regimes that they did not create. And they're trying to find a way to operate within them. Turkey, of course, as you know, had this Islamist party after Islamist party banned by the former Kemalist regime. And the successor parties kept on trying to find different ways of compromising on symbolism and language that would allow them to operate within the regime. And so the AKP, when it emerges, is not beginning from a space in which they can decide how they want to orient themselves. So one important distinction about the Tunisian case is that Tunisia, after 2011 and 2014, is radically democratic. They drafted a constitution not under occupation and not under the tutelage or supervision of the army like what happened in Egypt. And so this is a constitution that was not only done through the democratic resources of the parties that were elected there, but largely through Ennahda itself. And so you have a political system in which Ennahda is the co-author. They're not simply trying to accommodate an authoritarian regime that has simply been there. They are trying to define their place in a political regime that they were the co-authors of. So this turn to something called Muslim democracy has the appearance of something much more voluntary and much more of a recognition of political and sociological realities rather than merely the reality of authoritarian constraint. So that's another reason why I consider this turn to be very important. Finally, the reason why I think this is a special case of this use of the concept of Muslim democracy is because there's a direct continuity, not only from a political party that was traditionally understood and defined in ideological terms, but that was led by a figure who himself was not only one of the chief intellectuals of that party, but one of the chief intellectuals of the international Islamic public sphere. So Ghannouchi, throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, was an important Islamist intellectual throughout the Islamic world. He was read in Egypt, in Malaysia, in Turkey, in Qatar, and his views on the Islamic State or on democracy were not just pitched to Tunisians, but were pitched to the broader Islamist movement at large. So in some ways, his entire prestige as a political leader is to a large extent derived from the status that he had as an Islamic legal thinker and as an Islamic political theorist based on his writings from the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. So that's why you have an important question. Somebody that for many, many decades was talking about Islam and democracy in a different register, in a way that was a part of the 20th century tradition that included the more traditional Islamists, is now himself saying, we see politics in a different way. So that's a very interesting story. And I think many of the aspects of it are particular to Tunisia, the particular way that the Tunisian revolution developed, the particular mindset and ideology of Tunisians. But in some ways, what led to this kind of turn is, I think, indicative of sociological facts that hold for many Muslim countries. The fact that there is radical pluralism in any Muslim country where you have robust democracy. You don't just declare democracy and everybody reveals themselves to be pious Muslims yearning for an Islamic political order. You have the legacy of the modern state. You have the fact that politics involves many, many aspects of governance that Islamism traditionally was not very good at theorizing. So I think you have this turn to Muslim democracy. In some ways, it's very particular to Tunisia, but in some ways, I think is reflective of certain aspects of modern politics that confront Islamist political activists and theorists wherever you have the opportunity to engage in somewhat democratic politics. So that's kind of a pitch for the book for anybody that's interested in those themes. Let's see here. Okay. I want to try to be very brief about here. The second book that I wrote about the rise of popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought was premised on the observation, of course, that from the emergence of modern Islamism in the 1920s and 30s, you had this emphasis on divine sovereignty. This is what makes the Islamic State different from all other alternatives. But you have this problem, which is who is going to speak in the name of the divine law and who is going to articulate the boundaries between law and the political. And so one of the startling features of even Islamists like Maududi in Pakistan was that they were not trying to return to the classical Islamic model of governance before colonialism or before the Islamic State. They were not saying, let's go back to a system in which law was administered by the ulama through the courts, and there was a kind of secular ruler that had certain kind of authority in the public sphere, but recognized the authority of the scholars. They wanted to create a modern state. In some cases, that meant codification of the Sharia, which, as many modern students of Islamic law will tell you, represents either the radical transformation or the death of Islamic law to codify it by the state, but also the sense that there were other agents besides the scholars who represented Islamic knowledge and Islamic piety. So this notion that the people is God's caliph and the people has the ultimate agency in bringing about an Islamic order actually comes from Maududi. It's Maududi who we think of as one of the more conservative Islamists that wants to emphasize the absoluteness of divine sovereignty, that says the scholars have a role, but ultimately the people has received divine authority directly. And so this idea that culminates in theories of Islamic democracy and figures like Ghannouchi is actually introduced into the intellectual bloodstream by earlier figures like Maududi. I don't want to spend too much time on things like this. I only want to point at the development of this idea of Islamic democracy was in some ways a very, very sophisticated and technical study of how to understand the concept of sovereignty. So sovereignty involves all kinds of things: constituent authority, the authority to give new forms of rule, the ultimate right to legislate, ultimate powers of coercion. And of course, in the Islamic context, this runs into lots of questions. To what extent is the form of Islamic rule already given? There is to be a caliph or an imam, and the offices are already determined by God or the tradition, or to what extent can the people recreate and reform political institutions based on their own needs? To what extent is the law already given and known, and to what extent is the law constantly being remade or reformed by some kinds of agents? And if the law does not enforce itself, who has the authority to enforce the law? So these are all the kind of conceptual questions of sovereignty. The theory of Islamic democracy as a form of popular sovereignty, in my view, has these 7 features, somewhat obscured a little bit here by the Zoom, but it begins with this idea, of course, like I keep on mentioning, that the people is God's deputy on earth. And this, of course, has the feature of putting other traditional agents of power and authority in the Islamic tradition in their place, particularly the scholars and the traditional rulers. And so there is a place for those kinds of authorities, but their place is derived from appointment by the people rather than appointment by tradition or God or the law itself. It is a conception of politics that we political philosophers refer to as perfectionist. And the purpose of politics is to realize our ultimate good or our ultimate freedom. We have a certain nature, a fitra, that is given by God. Politics and law is there to realize our highest good and our highest purpose, not only to manage our various kinds of worldly disagreements. Divine sovereignty is still very, very central, but divine law is understood in a variety of ways, both as law that is written and known by tradition, but also as law that has to adapt to political purposes. The emphasis is on moral unity. It is assumed that the people engage in politics more or less agreed on their own purposes, their own nature, and the purposes of politics. So debates in Republican theory, like Montesquieu and Madison, about politics as how to protect against tyranny by balancing various sorts of power conflicts in society, is sort of minimized. Yes, there's a place for that, but not at the expense of the fundamental moral unity of the ummah. In this scheme, the people is the source of all political authorities. An interesting caveat to this: by the 2011 to 2013 Egyptian revolution, this has become a catchphrase on the part of all Islamist activists. Sha'ab masdar sulutat. The people is the source of political authorities, to the extent that even the Salafi parties in Egypt, and there were 2 or 3 major Salafi parties in Egypt, in their own party manifestos, they also included this phrase, Sha'ab masdar sulutat. The people is the source of political authorities. So this has become, by this point, a ubiquitous mantra in modern Islamic thinking. There's significant constituent power. How the people formulates a political system is open within certain kinds of constraints. And the people, and not just the scholars, participates in lawmaking. So that's the vision. That's the vision of a society that can be both democratic and Islamic. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time here. But here are some quotes in Ghannouchi's earlier work about the centrality of this idea of the people as God's caliph, and how This results in a consultative participatory model of politics in which both public policy but also the Islamic law are objects of consultation. I refer to this as a democracy, but as a kind of republic of virtue. It's not a democracy in the, again, liberal Republican tradition that says the basic fact of politics is conflict and disagreement, whether that's conflict about passions or ideology or desires, or conflict over interests and property and things like this. So again, the classical Republican theorizing from Montesquieu up to the American founders like Madison assumes that the purpose of politics is to find a way in which entirely internal to the system, you can recognize the fact that people have different passions, different religious beliefs, different interests, without allowing that to devolve either into civil war, into some kind of tyranny. And so the fundamental understanding of politics is a recognition of the legitimacy of those disagreements and finding ways for institutions to manage them. In this Islamic tradition, the assumption is rather that what's going to ultimately prevent against tyranny is not more and more complicated, divided institutions, but the virtue of the people. If the people is allowed to rule, they will never tolerate tyrants. They will never tolerate the manipulation of Islamic law. They will never tolerate the corruption of civil society. So you have many of the institutions of, I'll get this. Many of the institutions of modern constitutionalism, but the answer to the question, how do you prevent tyranny, is a combination of those institutions, but ultimately it's the power of the people. And again, I don't know what everybody here works on, but for those of you that study perhaps pre-modern Islamic thought, I think there's an interesting comparison, because when you read pre-modern Islamic thinkers, so much of this is about the ruler. There are kind of minimal and maximal conceptions of this, right? In, let's say, the minimal, realist, almost Hobbesian tradition of thinkers like Ibn Khaldun and others, who again also assume that politics is about conflict and politics is about passion. What you need is rulership, and it's the ruler that will prevent conflict. In other traditions, like the Ottoman philosophical Sufi mystical tradition, the Ottoman caliph also kind of becomes the figure from whom rains down the exemplar of virtue and spiritual perfection. So it's an interesting thing to note that the classical Islamic tradition sort of thinks that tyranny will be prevented by the rule of law and the scholars, but also by the office of the ruler or the caliphate. And so in modern Islamic thinkers, from Maududi through Ghanouchi, the answer is the virtuous people. And sometimes it can be hard to see the centrality of this, but I think it's very, very significant that there's this assumption that the people is unified, virtuous, and if given the chance to be the source of politics, will not allow for the corruption of the social order. All right, that's the previous theory. Now, what happens? I think we all know what happens politically and so forth. I don't want to belabor this. I assume that everybody in here is familiar with the broad outlines of the events in those countries that had a chance at democratic refounding, Egypt and Tunisia in particular. But the crucial fact that I want to focus on, in addition to the fact that Tunisia succeeded for 10 years, was the fact that unlike Egypt, you had a much more pluralistic political outcome. So the combined votes of the Islamists in the Egyptian Constituent Assembly were about 70%. In the Tunisian Constituent Assembly, they're about 41%. And so from the beginning, you had the formation of a constitution in which no single force could see itself as the overwhelming majority. And so you see the turn to a different conception of politics. And I put these two quotes next to each other, pointing out how close in time they were published. So up to 2012, in the publication of a book called Democracy and Human Rights in Islam, which is coming out in English translation shortly, Ghannouchi writes, the state loses its legitimacy and right to obedience to the extent that it departs from the law, that is the Sharia. This is what discredits every accusation against the Islamic State, that it is an absolutist authoritarian state. So there's this view that the Islamic State would be a rule of law, but because the Sharia is the law, and the Sharia does not belong to any human agent. Now note, a year later, in Islam, there's no church that can monopolize the interpretation of Islam, but this is left rather to the Ummah and the people through its institutions that translate the meanings of the phrase Arab Islamic identity. That was from the Constitution. And so when the question of Sharia was raised, we found it to be a subject of disagreement. But constitutions are not adopted on the basis of what there is disagreement around, but rather what is agreed upon. So in this turn to a new form of rule, you see this idea that the very idea of the Islamic Sharia is not the background source of unity of the people, but itself is the object of disagreement. And so if what you want is a political regime to be founded by consensus, you have to put that off to the side. And so going through these essays that are translated, what I argue is the 5 most consistent points that he raises when he's trying to justify the adoption of this secular constitution is first that we should see politics not in this perfectionist sense as the realization of our essence or our highest good, but as a contract between specific parties around worldly goods. There's a recognition of the fact of pluralism. The existing range of pluralism or disagreement should be treated as a constraint on politics. Therefore, agreement and consensus is the first virtue of politics at the constitution-making level. The Sharia, he writes it in a number of places, means nothing other than anything that limits government, prevents tyranny, and provides for the rule of law. And the ultimate Islamic proof text for all of this is the Prophet's Wasiqat al-Medina, or the Covenant of Medina, the contract between the Prophet Muhammad and the tribes of Medina, in which, on Ghannouchi's reading, is not the original creation of an Islamic state power, but a covenant between parties, tribes that disagree on religion, to cooperate on worldly matters, on matters that pertain to their interests in this world. And so he says at one point that we are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state, as if to say that if this kind of limited form of politics was good enough for the Prophet, who are we to say that it's not good enough for us? And here are a few quotes, again, emphasizing the importance of arriving at agreement with existing parties, not with some idealized conception of the Ummah. He talks about, there was a kind of compromise in the Tunisian constitution about recognizing human rights as universal. And he said that we should be happy with this because it's something that we can arrive at agreement upon. And we are in basic agreement with the substance of these rights. So there's no reason for us not to acknowledge them as universal. So when you start to ask, well, what's Muslim about this? Or what's Islamic about this? How could this be a long-term kind of principled conception of politics? You might ask, is this new conception of Sharia, is that like a permanent statement about what it is? Or something for the present that in the future, perhaps a different demographic majority could revisit and decide to change? And second, what is the basis of this acceptance of pluralism? Is it just as a fact on the ground, or as a brute fact? Is it given by necessity, or is there something principled about it? Is there some way in which all of these people that don't recognize Islam and Sharia as the basis for politics, are they driven by some kind of reasonable mode of approaching these questions, or are they just a fact that you have to accept, like desertification or the lack of rain, or that the Mediterranean Sea is in front of you? So these are the kinds of things that I was particularly interested in and spent a lot of time discussing with Ghannouchi in our dialogue. And so when we talk about how to theorize this idea of Muslim democracy, I give a number of different possibilities. Unlike some people, I do think that there was an ideology behind it. I do think that there's an approach to politics behind it that ought to be taken seriously. I do think that this lesson from the Covenant of Medina is worth thinking about, although a lot of people find it to be a sort of a less than principled move. But when you want to think about what approach to politics does this represent, especially given the fact that some of the same thinkers and same political actors had developed a different approach to politics. How should we think about it? So one possibility is, if you guys are familiar with the political theorist John Rawls and the idea of an overlapping consensus versus a constitutional consensus, you might say that this represents a constitutional consensus, but not an overlapping consensus. There's an agreement to conduct politics this way for moral reasons. Democracy is better than authoritarianism, and it's better than civil war. Democracy, even in this imperfect sense, contains some very great values. The search for agreement, the search for consensus, the search for coalitions, the attempt to speak across divides. These are valuable things, even if they're not, as Ghannouchi once said, they're not muqaddasa. These are not, the Constitution is not sacred, but it's better in a principled way than what we had before and what the alternative is. But that would acknowledge that there may still be some deep philosophical agreements about how people ought to view themselves or how people ought to view politics. The legal theorist Cass Sunstein has referred to incompletely theorized agreements, that you make some kind of a social contract without the deep theory underpinning it being a necessary accomplishment before you can be committed to the agreement. Another concept that political theorists like to talk about is ideal versus non-ideal theory. And so in an ideal conception of politics, you begin with the assumption that you have the ummah. You have a people that regards itself as Muslim. But in a non-ideal circumstance, you have people that have been perhaps misformed by colonialism, by secularism, by feminism. And so you develop a separate theory about how to respond to contingency, to respond to facts that you did not make and do not necessarily regard as ideal, but are nonetheless the circumstances in which you act. Then there's the theory that I began with, which is that it's simply political rhetoric, that there isn't really a theory, doctrine, ideology, or philosophy behind it. It's branding, it's signaling. You know, we have to remember what's not very hard to remember, because of course, ultimately, Tunisia did suffer a coup in 2021. But then in all of these years, you had the coup in Egypt in 2013, with tens of thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood either killed or imprisoned. And so you had the ambivalent attitude of European and North American powers towards the transition in Tunisia and other countries. And so to say, hey, we're not Islamists, we're Muslim Democrats, has an obvious tactical, even strategic role to play. We shouldn't think about it any deeper than that. Now, ultimately, I want to make the argument that all those preceding things are not wrong, but there is a way to understand this ideologically. And the first is, as I began with, as post-sovereigntist. Now, remember, when Islamists have traditionally been thinking about sovereignty, whether it's divine or popular, what those two concepts have in common is a certain kind of unity of will. The idea of sovereignty imagines that there's a single willing agent, whether it's the king, God, the Rousseauvian people, but to imagine the people as sovereign implies that you have to be able to imagine the people speaking in a single voice. And so that leads to certain kinds of problems that you try to solve. How can we imagine the people as unified? How can we imagine when and where the people speaks in a sovereign voice? Who is the real people? When is the people really speaking? And in the Islamic context, in some ways, it was quite easy because it's not hard to just say, well, the people is the ummah, the people is Muslim, the people is pious. The Egyptians have a method, right? The people is religious by nature. And so there's, it was not a hard problem to just say, unlike you Westerners, we have a demos. We have a people that can speak in a unitary way. There's the prophet's hadith. My people will not agree on an error. So if the people is unified, they are correct. Now, what happens when you look at all this Muslim democratic writing? You don't have a new conception of sovereignty. The problem of sovereignty just kind of vanishes. You're no longer thinking in terms of sovereignty. You're no longer thinking in terms of who is the sovereign agent that has the right to will in a way that gives legitimacy. No, you begin with the fact that politics is here. It's real, it's messy, it's risky, it's dangerous. And your goal is to formulate some kind of order out of that reality that allows for specific goods. Less torture, less prison, less authoritarianism, less corruption, more participation, more civil liberties, more religious freedom. And so the whole imaginary of a sovereign agent goes away. And there's a tradition in political philosophy that is very skeptical of the idea of sovereignty, coming from Hannah Arendt and so forth. So that's one thing that I want to kind of put into the literature, that we should see Muslim democracy as post-sovereigntist. It's no longer obsessed with the definition of sovereignty, which was the primary obsession of Islamist political thought from the 1920s until now. And second, it's not moderate. It's not just democratic or tolerant. It's also agonistic, meaning that it fundamentally sees politics as a struggle for primacy. And so very often, particularly in the West, you say, oh, Ennahda is moderate. Why did they oppose this law? Why did they support laws against blasphemy? Why did they do? If they're really so moderate, they would be completely leaving religion out of politics. But that democracy doesn't require that, and pluralism doesn't require that. Rather, I suggest that what this is it sees politics rather than the pre-political order as the site of struggling for your conception. And so we assume that everybody is going to be struggling for their conception of what they want. And that's how we see politics. But it's done without violence. It's done without the threat of imprisonment, without the threat of coup, without the threat of eradicating your enemies. You recognize them as legitimate competitors, not as infidels or not as terrorists that you're trying to eradicate. And that's the mutual recognition that Ghannouchi is trying to also elicit from his secular rivals. So in a phrase, that's what I kind of want to put into the public as the way to understand it, as post-sovereigntist, agonistic political Islam, which does two things. It recognizes the historical nature of the break with previous understandings of Islamism, but it also stops us from asking banal questions like, if they're so moderate, why do they still want a different family law? Or why do they still want to protect religion? Because you have the wrong conception of what democracy as agonistic struggle requires. Right. I'm going to stop there. I have some more thoughts about what it would mean for a thicker theory of a post-sovereigntist agonistic political Islam. But I've already been going on for quite a while, and I want to leave some time to hear what you guys have to say. This last thing? Yeah, so, there's a lot of political theorists who are very disgruntled with what the Oxonians and the philosophers from Harvard and Princeton did to political theory over the past 50 years. So there are many people that say people like John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin and others made politics seem too much like an application of ethical theory. If you read Kant enough, if you get your morality straight, then you can devise a theory of justice and democracy that is too much about morality and not enough about actual politics. And so instead, what political theory ought to be doing is thinking about politics as a autonomous domain of experience. Politics has its own logic, it has its own genealogies, it has its own dynamics, that it's not just derivative of ethics. And in some ways, this is perfectly applied to Islamic political thought, because you can say that Islamic political thought in the 20th century did the exact same thing. It said politics, we don't really need to understand that much about actual politics. All we need to understand is the theology. Does God demand to be sovereign? Yes. Has God given us a law? Yes. Is that law complete and sufficient? Yes. Are we infidels if we usurp God's law? Yes. That's the theology. That's the ethics. Does divine law give us an answer to almost everything? Yes, it does. So politics is just the mirror of theology and law. And so all you need to know about politics is what ethics demands. Okay, so in some ways, you have a parallel concern between modern liberal political philosophy and Islamic political thought, and that they both tended to see politics just as a place to apply what you already know from ethics. Now, if you ditch that assumption, what happens if you begin from certain kinds of assumptions about what politics actually is? So one way of taking that is that politics is about not the realization of perfection, but the reduction of evil. So many utopian thinkers have said politics is where we become fully human. The Greeks had a way of thinking about that. The communists had a way of thinking like that. The Islamists had a way of thinking like that. But we also see from history how either that is extremely dangerous or how that is misguided. You never actually become fully human through these political projects. It just devolves into the rule of the Communist Party or the rule of elites or something like that, or the rule of the Republican Guard, which is very far from even what Khomeini imagined. Too bad Sajjad is not here to have this discussion. Instead, what if you imagine politics as the management of evil, the management of the worst things that can happen? And here I think Islamists are very well situated to contribute to this, because Islamists have experienced decades of imprisonment, torture, persecution, assassination. And so there's something of this in Ghanouchi's thought, which is that, you know, even reducing the evil that politics is capable of is a great achievement. Second, the Islamic State became fetishized for Islamists throughout the 20th century. State. Teen wa dawla. We are creating an Islamic State. And as we know, it's very trendy in Islamic studies right now to say the state cannot be Islamic. So those of you that may have read a little bit too much Wael Halak or others that say that Islam and the state are incompatible, because there was never a state in Islam. The state is purely a modern, amoral invention that does nothing but destroy Islamic law. Even if you don't go as far as Halak, you can say that, what if you actually studied the history of Islamic law, Islamic virtue, Islamic governance, Islamic modes of thriving outside of the obsession with the state? You will get different genealogies of what good societies and forms of life look like. There's some of that in Ghanouchi's thought that comes out in our dialogues, where he has different sites of Islamic history that are inspirational. One of them, not too surprisingly, is something like 9th century Baghdad. Not because it's the Islamic golden age of Abbasid power only, but because the place where you had atheists, you had philosophers, you had Muslims of different kinds, and you didn't need to have state power to thrive, and you didn't need to eradicate everybody else for your own sphere of life to be thriving. And so he's finding different genealogies of pluralism and virtue that don't require kind of sovereign state power. A kind of realistic accounting of the actual Islamic tradition of state power. So the death of the of the Arab Spring, you know, is is problematic, because on the one hand, people want to say, see, this is what happens when you don't take power through violence. They're never going to accept you. You can compromise on everything like Ghannouchi did, and they'll still imprison you. So the only way is to seize power. And that either looks like Erdogan, a long, slow march through the institutions to take power, or like Iran. The problem is, neither of those two examples look anything like what Islamism traditionally aspired to. The only thing that's there is the state power. And so some kind of deep political critique of the state, even when you seize it, as something that can realize the goals that you claim to believe in. And there's a lot of that in Ghannouchi's thought, a self-critique of Islamic forms of authoritarianism, particularly Iran, which is the most popular one. But even in private, he has said this to me about Erdogan. In public, obviously, he has to be a lot more conciliatory because Erdogan was a great ally, but was not his model of what he wanted Ennahda to be. And then I already mentioned that next one, but then finally, one of the things that you see in a lot of reformist thought, I don't know if people have looked at the Iranian reformists after the 1990s or others, but when you study Islamism up until whenever, the dominant emphasis is on law. Law has all the answers. Islam is law. Islam is the Sharia. And that's not just the site of power and the site of authority, but it's also the epistemology. It's the mode of knowing. How do you know if something is Islamic? It's a legal question. And it gives itself to the question of the various adillah, right? Where's your dalil? And again, this is true, I think, across both the Sunni and the Shia thinkers. When you read Khomeini's Hukumet Islami, everything is there, ready and waiting. Islamic law has all the answers. It's ready and waiting. And we scholars rule simply because we're the ones that know the law. Now, when you see a lot of the reformist thinkers that grapple with the legacy of what happened in Iran, people like Surush and Kadivar and others, as well as other figures like Taha Abdurrahman, you get this sense that it's important to think about what Islamic ethics are, not just as a branch of law. What is Islamic ethics as an independent form of thought? And that ought to perhaps be the dominant form of thought. So in Surush, this is the most obvious. Surush just comes right out and says, we need to break with the legal imaginary and replace it with the ethical. Before many of the scandals that I'm sure you're all aware of, when Tariq Ramadan was more of a figure in European Islamic thought, he was saying something very similar, that the Islamic legal imaginary has to give way to an Islamic ethical imaginary. And so what happens if you started to think about politics not just as a space to apply Islamic law or something like Islamic law, but to develop an Islamic political ethics beyond this sort of epistemic and methodological framework? So if you were to say that a new theory of politics emerged, perhaps overlapping with or not with this concept of Muslim democracy, but one that prioritized the political and prioritized the contingent and prioritized history, these, I think, are the questions and the features that you might see coming to the surface. Or not. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Can you also there? That's not the better. Can you hear us on Zoom? Twice. Is there any? No. Do you see any reply coming from Zoom that they can hear?
Click on the chat where it says chat.
They would have told us.
Click on chat.
Hopefully, so, yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, this was fascinating. Plus, this last thought on ethics versus law. Interestingly, I think today we live in a society in which we get rules about everything every day. And then having too much rules and laws is to the detriment of moral agency and yes, and personal engagement. We do way too many things because to fulfill the requirements and law instead of doing them right. So that's just, it's not only an Islamic problem, we have it in our own society rampant now. Yes, so I closed the recording and then open the floor for questions.